From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The time for excuses is over. Now is the time for strength. If you want peace, you must stand strong at all times. The world.
President Trump continues his five-nation tour of Asia today. He's in Vietnam for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. In Korea, he attempted to visit the demilitarized zone, but his fleet of helicopters with the press was turned back because of weather. We'll speak with Professor Bruce Cummings, who just returned from Seoul, South Korea, where Trump was met with protests.
We do not want Trump to visit South Korea because he keeps on talking about war in the Korean Peninsula and putting pressure on commerce and forcing weapons trading. How can we welcome someone like this to Pyeongtaek and South Korea?
Then, as Democracy Now! Heads to the United Nations Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany, there will be several delegations from the U.S. Although President Trump says he's pulling the U.S. out of the climate accord, the Trump administration will be there to push coal, gas, and nuclear power. A number of mayors and governors will also be in Bonn, saying we're still in.
We Are Still In is a coalition of mayors, governors, business leaders, university presidents, NGOs, and others that are committed to meeting America's obligations under the Paris Agreement.
We'll speak with 350.org founder Bill McKibben about the future of the Climate Accord, the latest climate catastrophes, and we'll talk to him about his new first novel, Radio Free Vermont, a fable of resistance. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. At least 4 women have accused Roy Moore, the Republican nominee in Alabama for a U.S. Senate seat, of making sexual advances on them while they were teenagers, including one woman who says Moore forced himself on her when she was 14 years old and he was 32. Lee Korfman says Moore removed her shirt and pants, touched her over her bra and underwear. She recalls thinking, quote, "I wanted it over with. I want it out. Please just get this over with. Whatever this is, just get it over," unquote. Roy Moore is a former state Supreme Court justice who's currently running to fill Attorney General Jeff Sessions' Senate seat. Some Republicans are calling on Moore to withdraw, but even if he does, other Republican candidates will have to be written in for the December 12th special election. On Thursday, Alabama State Auditor Jim Ziegler attempted to defend Roy Moore, saying, quote, "Take Joseph and Mary. Mary was a teenager, and Joseph was an adult carpenter. They became parents of Jesus. There's just nothing immoral or illegal here, maybe just a little bit unusual," he said. Stephen Bannon, the head of the far right-wing media outlet Breitbart News, has also defended Roy Moore by attacking the Washington Post. Bannon is Trump's former chief strategist and has been a major backer of Roy Moore's Senate race.
The Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post that dropped that dime on Donald Trump is the same Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post that dropped the dime this afternoon on Judge Roy Moore. Now, is that a coincidence? That's what I mean when I say opposition party.
In a statement, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, quote, "Like most Americans, the president believes we cannot allow a mere allegation, in this case one from many years ago, to destroy a person's life," unquote. President Trump himself has been accused of sexual assault and harassment by multiple women. During the 2016 election, Trump called these women liars and threatened to sue them, although he has not sued them. One woman has, in turn, sued Trump for libel for calling her a liar. Roy Moore is famous for having been twice ousted as Alabama's Chief Justice, first in 2003 for refusing to remove a monument of the Ten Commandments in the rotunda of the Alabama Judicial Building. After being reelected, he was again ousted in 2016 for ordering his judges to defy the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling legalizing marriage equality. Moore is also well known for his racist, Islamophobic, and homophobic positions. In 2005, he said homosexuality should be illegal, comparing it to bestiality. Meanwhile, other sexual harassment allegations allegations continue to rock state politics and Hollywood. Multiple women have accused Minnesota State Senator Dan Schoen of sexual harassment. The women say he groped and touched them without their consent and that he sent at least one woman a photo of male genitalia over Snapchat. Several lawmakers and Minnesota Governor Mark Dayton are calling on Schoen to resign. This comes after Kentucky State Congressman Jeff Hoover has resigned as Kentucky's House Speaker after it surfaced he'd settled a sex harassment claim with one of his female staff members. He's refusing to give up his seat altogether despite escalating pressure. 5 women have come forward to accuse powerful comedian Louis C.K. of sexual harassment and misconduct, including masturbating in front of them. The revelations, first reported by the New York Times, come after years of speculation and rumors about Louis C.K. using his power in the comedy world to repeatedly sexually harass fellow female comedians. The premiere of Louis C.K.'s movie I Love You, Daddy was quickly canceled Thursday ahead of the article's publication in the New York Times. Meanwhile, Emmy award-winning writer Kader Gordon has accused Matthew Weiner, the creator of the hit TV show Mad Men, of sexual harassment. Gordon says Weiner says the two were working together on Mad Men when, quote, he told me I owed it to him to let him see me naked, unquote. Gordon was let go from the show a year later, and film director Ridley Scott is in the process of editing actor Kevin Spacey out of the nearly finished movie All the Money in the World, after more than a dozen men accused Kevin Spacey of sexual harassment and assault. Kevin Spacey's scenes are currently being refilmed with a new actor, Christopher Plummer. In Bonn, Germany, a coalition of U.S. cities, companies, universities, and faith groups have opened a 2,500-square-meter pavilion outside the UN climate conference called We're Still In, an effort to persuade other countries that wide swaths of the United States are still committed to the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Accord. This is Alden Mayer of the Union of Concerned Scientists.
We Are Still In is a coalition of mayors, governors, business leaders, university presidents, NGOs, and others that are committed to meeting America's obligations under the Paris Agreement. Well, actually, the public opinion polls show that an overwhelming majority of Americans support Paris. They want the U.S. to provide leadership. They don't support what President Trump did. Even a majority of Trump's own voters support more clean energy, solar energy, clean cars. They like the solutions to climate change. And of course, in the wake of the recent extreme weather events, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Jose, Hurricane Maria, there's increasing recognition that the cost of not doing something on climate change could be quite astronomical.
This comes as officials in Puerto Rico have acknowledged that nearly 500 more people died this September compared to September of last year. The data further cast doubt on the authorities' claims that Hurricane Maria killed only 55 people. Meanwhile, Puerto Rico's capital, San Juan, and other northern cities in Puerto Rico were plunged back into darkness on Thursday after a main power line failed. The power line that failed was originally repaired by the tiny Montana-based company Whitefish Energy, whose $300 million contract was canceled amidst controversy over Whitefish's ties to Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. Democracy Now! Is headed to Bonn, Germany. Tune into our coverage all next week when we broadcast from the UN Climate Summit. U.S. officials say the Pentagon is planning to send hundreds more U.S. soldiers to Afghanistan in early 2018, boosting the number of U.S. troops in the country to about 16,000 soldiers. This comes as the United Nations says a U.S. airstrike near the northern city of Kunduz killed at least 10 civilians last week. The UN findings contradict a U.S. military investigation which claims no civilians were killed in the November 4th airstrike. Local officials say up to 55 civilians may have been killed. U.S. airstrikes in Afghanistan have increased dramatically under President Trump. The Syrian armies declared victory over ISIS in Syria after the army says it seized control of Abu Kamal, the final ISIS-controlled city inside Syria. Meanwhile, the United Nations is warning of a humanitarian crisis in eastern Ghouta, which is besieged by the Syrian army. UN humanitarian advisor Jan Egeland says 400,000 civilians are in acute need of aid, which has been blocked by the Assad government.
This epicenter of suffering has 400,000 civilians, men, women, and children, in a dozen besieged towns and villages. I feel as if we're now returning to some of the bleakest days of this conflict again. At least the fears are that we are now returning with civilians in crossfire in too many provinces at the same time.
In news from Washington, D.C., Senate Republicans have unveiled a competing plan for overhauling the tax code as Republican lawmakers scramble to push through Trump's proposed tax plan. The Senate version is different from the House version in several ways, including proposing to delay the dramatic cuts to the corporate tax rate by a year. President Trump has made the tax overhaul a top legislative priority. His plan would shower billions of dollars in tax cuts upon the wealthiest Americans, including President Trump's family and members of his administration. Special counsel Robert Mueller is investigating whether former White House National Security Advisor Mike Flynn plotted to kidnap Turkish cleric Fethullah Gulen, who lives in the Poconos in Pennsylvania, and forcibly return him to Turkey for $15 million. The Turkish government views Gulen as a political enemy and has accused him of plotting a failed military coup in 2016. The investigation centers on a December meeting between Flynn and representatives of the Turkish government, including Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's son-in-law and Turkey's foreign minister. Flynn was working as a foreign agent for the Turkish government last fall, even as he served as a top advisor to Donald Trump's campaign, and failed to disclose his lobbying efforts as required by law. He and his son, Mike Flynn, are being investigated. President Trump's former bodyguard and longtime confidant, Keith Schuller, is reportedly testified to the House Intelligence Committee that he rejected an offer by Russia to send women to Donald Trump's hotel room during a 2013 visit to Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant. The questions came in response to a dossier about Trump compiled by former British spy Christopher Steele during the 2016 election. The dossier detailed links between Trump's campaign and Russia and alleged that Russia had damaging sexual information about then-candidate Donald Trump. New reports have surfaced showing how White House Chief of Staff John Kelly tried to unsuccessfully pressure the acting Department of Homeland Security Secretary Elaine Duke to cancel the special immigration status of more than 50,000 Hondurans living in the United States. The Washington Post reports Kelly called Duke and tried to convince her to cancel the Hondurans' TPS. Duke refused, although she did announce the cancellation of the temporary protected status for 2,500 Nicaraguans. And in Boston, Massachusetts, residents are demanding immigration authorities release activist Siham Baya, who is facing deportation to Morocco. Baya is the mother of an 8-year-old boy who is a U.S. citizen. Hundreds of people rallied earlier this week outside the federal building in Boston to demand her freedom, saying she's being targeted for her political activism. She has now launched a hunger strike. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump is in Vietnam to attend the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, known as APEC, and discuss trade with leaders of 21 member countries. The visit is part of his 5-nation tour in Asia. Hours after leaving China, Trump took the stage of the APEC summit and gave an address that criticized China's lack of a balanced trade relationship with the United States and condemned the multilateral accords pursued by past presidents.
For many years, the United States systematically opened our economy with few conditions. We lowered or ended tariffs, reduced trade barriers, and allowed foreign goods to flow freely into our country. But while we lowered market barriers, other countries didn't open their markets to us. Funny. They must have been one of the beneficiaries. Simply put, we have not been treated fairly by the World Trade Organization. Organizations like the WTO can only function properly when all members follow the rules and respect the sovereign rights of every member. We cannot achieve open markets if we do not ensure fair market access. I do not blame China or any other country, of which there are many, for taking advantage of the United States on trade. If their representatives are able to get away with it, they are just doing their jobs. I wish previous administrations in my country saw what was happening and did something about it.
Immediately after President Trump made his address, Chinese President Xi Jinping took the stage to deliver a starkly contrasting speech that called for more global trade agreements. The Chinese leader also said he supports the Paris Climate Accord.
We have seen a profound change in economic globalization over the last few decades. Economic globalization has contributed significantly to global growth. Indeed, it has become an irreversible historical trend. In the face of deep changes in the global economy, does the Asia-Pacific region have the bravery to face the wave of reform and innovation, or do we hesitate? Should we steer economic globalization, or should we dither in the face of challenges? Should we jointly advance regional cooperation, or should we go our separate ways?
Shortly before Trump arrived in Da Nang, Vietnam, where the APEC summit is taking place, the White House announced he will not have a formal meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is also in town to attend the APEC summit. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said Thursday a meeting between the two leaders would depend on if they had, quote, sufficient substance to talk about. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said the leaders may meet at an upcoming regional conference in the Philippines. She also said they might have an informal meeting in Da Nang. This comes as Trump said Thursday after meetings with China's president that he wants Russia's help in getting North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. Trump spent much of his trip in Asia focused on North Korea. He told leaders of South Korea's government Wednesday that the United States stands ready to attack North Korea over its nuclear weapons program. While in Korea, Trump attempted to visit the demilitarized zone, but his fleet of helicopters that included the press was turned back because of bad weather. Trump's first stop on his Asia trip took him to Japan, where he said Japan could shoot North Korean missiles out of the sky with military equipment bought from the U.S. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has responded his country could intercept missiles if necessary and said he's looking into the deal. President Trump was pushing billions of dollars of weapons on Japan. Well, for more, we're joined in Chicago by Bruce Cummings, professor of history at the University of Chicago, just returned from Seoul, South Korea last evening. He's the author of several books on Korea, including Korea's Place in the Sun of Modern History and North Korea, Another Country. Professor Cummings, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about how President Trump was met in South Korea, where you also were?
Well, President Trump was given a red carpet treatment by the government, just as he was in Japan and China. But there were large protests right outside the American Embassy, which is in downtown Seoul. There were maybe over 1,000 protesters, and entirely against Trump, saying particularly no war. I was really struck by the violence of emotion on that particular issue. Koreans are under the threat of war, of course, from North Korea. The DMZ is just 35 miles from Seoul, and that's been the case for decades and decades. But Trump has raised an immediate issue of attacking North Korea, as you just said. And I've never experienced the kind of emotion that I saw both in the protests and in the conference that I attended. People in the audience were standing up and saying things like, Trump is 10 times more dangerous than Kim Jong-un, and then everybody clapped. But it's remarkable that Trump is running through East and Southeast Asia talking about North Korea, but he only spent a little over a day in Korea, and instead is discussing Korean problems with Prime Minister Abe in Tokyo and President Xi in China. He manages to denigrate South Korea without even trying. He told Abe over the phone some weeks ago that the South Korean president was engaged in appeasement. And I just think the relations between South Korea and the United States are bad, and they're probably going to get worse.
Well, I just wanted to turn to some of the protests you describe as hundreds gathered as Trump toured the U.S. Army base Camp Humphreys.
We do not want Trump to visit South Korea because he keeps on talking about war in the Korean Peninsula and putting pressure on commerce and forcing weapons trading. How can we welcome someone like this to Pyeongtaek and South Korea?
So, Bruce Cummings, if you could respond to that. And also, if you think Trump changed his tone from talking about little rocket man and talking about, you know, the fire and fury, bringing that down on the 25 million North Koreans, to, well, taking a different approach, maybe, in fact, more cutting for the North Korean leader, talking about his grandfather and his father.
Well, I think Trump modulated his violent rhetoric while he was in Korea. That's the least he could do. I didn't see anything in what Trump said that indicated a diplomatic approach in the wings, a diplomatic approach to North Korea. Essentially, he said almost nothing when he was in Korea, nothing that was newsworthy. I thought it was interesting that his staff told everybody that Trump wasn't going to go to the DMZ because that's become a cliche for American presidents. And then yesterday he tried to get in his helicopter and fly up to the DMZ to look tough in the face of the North Koreans. But it was a very foggy day, and he couldn't land, as you said.
I mean, this is very interesting. They actually, just to say, they actually flew 5 minutes outside of the DMZ, not only Marine One, President Trump's helicopter, but the press following. And then they were stopped, many might call it poetic justice, by the climate.
Well, it is a cliche where American presidents glare into the North and flex their muscles. Vice President Pence has already been there doing that. To me, it's just a symbol of the immobility of American policy toward Korea going back 60 years now. The DMZ was formed in 1953. We have just an armistice that ended the Korean War in that year. And it would be a major step forward if the U.S. would at least try to get together with North Korea and China and put an end to the state of war. I was going to say about his trip to the military base in Pyeongtaek, that's the largest American military base in the world outside the United States. The U.S. has operational control in a crisis of 650,000 South Korean soldiers. And yet the National Security Council head, Mr. General McMaster, chided South Korea for not protecting its sovereignty over a deal that South Korea made with China just before Trump showed up. I think that's probably the most important thing regarding South Korea that happened on this trip. China and South Korea agreed that there would be no more THAAD anti-missile batteries installed in South Korea. And the South Korean president said explicitly that he would not join an alliance of the U.S. and Japan, whether it's targeted at China or anybody else. And he pointedly said, the U.S. is an ally. We have a mutual defense treaty with Korea. Japan is not an ally. And then he or his staff brought a comfort woman, 88 years old, in other words, a sex slave of the Japanese army, to meet with Trump when he was in Korea. So the Japanese weren't too happy about that. But it's absolutely ridiculous that the U.S. keeps trying to knock together a tripartite alliance between Japan, Korea, and the United States when relations between Japan and Korea are still as bad as they are, and Japan has never really issued a proper apology for putting more than 100,000 Korean women into sex slavery.
And can you talk about both the role of China when it comes to North Korea and also the role of Russia? It's not exactly clear if President Trump will be meeting with Vladimir Putin in Da Nang, Vietnam, at the APEC summit. There's been a lot of controversy swirling around it. They said he was going to, and now they're saying it'll be an informal kind of poolside meeting. But you don't usually hear Russia talked about very much with North Korea. What role does Russia play?
Well, I mean, it's absurd to say that Trump and Putin don't have anything substantive to talk about. They have about 15 substantive things they could talk about. But anyway, Russia actually has better relations with North Korea right now than China does. Putin has been trying to say some, I think, fairly level-headed things about the situation, particularly that no matter how much you sanction North Korea, the North Koreans are going to eat grass before they give up their nuclear weapons, which is exactly right. The sanctions have never worked. You know, North Korea has been sanctioned since early 1950, before the Korean War. Most of your listeners, you know, weren't alive then. Maybe their parents weren't alive then. Just constant sanctions, slapping on more sanctions. North Korea gets its back to the wall, which is what the situation they deal with best. And over time, it turns out nothing happens in terms of the sanctions actually yielding positive results. North Korea's relationship with China is about as bad as it's ever been. These were very close allies for decades during the Korean War and the Cold War thereafter. Kim Il-sung and his son were very close to top Chinese leaders. But Kim Jong-un has not met Xi Jinping, hasn't been invited to Beijing, which used to be a ritual for a new North Korean leader. And the Chinese have been trying to send an envoy to Pyongyang for weeks. And Pyongyang keeps saying, you know, stay home, we know what you're going to say. North Korea looks at China as basically ganging up on it with the United States. And the U.S. has this fantasy that somehow China is going to be able to turn the screws hard enough on North Korea that North Korea will yell uncle and give up its nuclear weapons. That's never going to happen. But it reflects the poor understanding in Washington, the poor understanding of Sino-North Korean relations. China's never going to do anything that would seriously threaten the stability of that regime.
How close do you think the U.S. is to nuclear war with North Korea, Professor Cummings?
Well, I was asked that by people in Korea who have a little bit more interest in the subject than we do, although probably their missiles can reach here in Chicago. I've been thinking about this question for 6 months, and I can't believe anyone in their right mind would want to launch a preemptive attack, either to take out, if it could be done, North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles, or to decapitate the regime, which we talk about, or which the Pentagon and inside the Beltway people talk about, as if that would be great if we could get away with it. It's, of course, completely in violation of international law to do something like that. A nuclear war between North Korea and the United States would devastate the region, but more than that, it would probably lead to at least 2 years of nuclear winter, where the debris swirling around the planet and the atmosphere would make it impossible to grow crops. Anyone who talks about nuclear war in this day and age, with all we know about nuclear winter and the terrible effects of nuclear weapons, is basically a war criminal, in my view. Nuclear weapons should never be used, and especially to see a president of the United States go to the United Nations and threaten to totally destroy North Korea. I mean, that was just nauseating. And one thing he forgot, since he knows no history, is we already did that during the Korean War. We razed every North Korean city to the ground with firebombing and incendiaries, and it still didn't work. They still fought us to a stalemate. There's no military solution in Korea. We should have recognized that in 1953.
What is being eviscerated right now is the State Department. It doesn't get as much attention, but there have been alarms going off for a while now that the diplomatic corps, the highest levels of the State Department, are basically, people are leaving. They're not being replaced. Can you talk about what would be a diplomatic solution, what you could see that President Trump certainly has not gone down the path of, but also President Obama, and before that, what could lead to peace in Korea, and would it mean a united Korea, North and South?
Well, I mean, Trump went to East Asia without an undersecretary or whatever they call it, assistant secretary for East Asian Affairs, which is the highest position for that region in the State Department. I don't think there's ever been a president on an East Asian trip without that crucial position being filled. Tillerson doesn't even care about the State Department in spite of being the head of the State Department. And you're right, I mean, it's been gutted. The expertise is just flying out the window on any number of issues. What would solve the Korean problem, and it's important to say, you know, to put this alongside the horrible specter of nuclear war, is for the U.S. to agree to freeze its own huge military exercises in South Korea in return for a freeze on North Korean testing of its missiles and atomic bombs. That's a so-called freeze for freeze proposal that, for example, former Secretary of Defense William Perry supports. The Chinese support it. It's not clear that the North Koreans support it, but we haven't tried. And then once that freeze is in place, to open diplomatic relations with North Korea. It's important to understand that diplomacy is not something you do among friends, although you do it. Diplomacy arose in world history to deal with enemies. We've had no diplomatic relations with North Korea for 72 years. And it hasn't hurt them any more than the sanctions, or it's hurt them. But it is something that could easily be remedied if the U.S. sent an ambassador to Pyongyang, whereupon we might finally get some influence over this regime. They have wanted diplomatic relations with the United States for 25 years. And Mr. Perry, when he was running the so-called Perry process for Bill Clinton, new negotiations and diplomacy with North Korea from 1998 to 2000, said, you know, two things that are absolutely true. One, we should establish diplomatic relations with Pyongyang. And number two, their nuclear weapons and missiles are for deterrence. And if I can just say one more thing about that. In the middle of this summer, the North Koreans started saying, and Kim Jong-un said this, that they're building their deterrent toward an endpoint that is approaching soon. In other words, an endpoint that would allow them to feel comfortable that they have a significant deterrent, but they're not going to go ahead and build an entire arsenal of ICBMs and nuclear weapons. They want to be able to defend themselves. And that was a clear signal, finally picked up by Joel Witt in the New York Times yesterday, a clear signal that North Korea would like to get involved in diplomacy once it feels that its deterrent is secure. They have not tested any missiles or bombs now for 2 months, or almost 2 months. I think the last one was September 15th. So that's also a signal that they're ready for diplomacy.
Well,
and when you put those relatively modest steps alongside the catastrophic nature of a new war in Korea, it just seems to me the overwhelming choice is to start talking to North Korea and stop treating them like a criminal and a pariah and calling them names, which only has the effect of verifying to the North Korean public that their leadership has been right all along. The U.S. just wants to destroy North Korea.
Bruce Cummings, I want to thank you for being with us. Just back from Seoul, South Korea, professor of history at University of Chicago, author of a number of books on Korea, like Korea's Place in the Sun, A Modern History, and North Korea, Another Country. 60% of the State Department's equivalent of 4-star generals are gone, according to new data from the American Foreign Service Association, the professional organization for America's diplomatic corps. The numbers reveal American diplomacy, the backbone of U.S. global influence, is in a state of near collapse. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, President Trump, after Vietnam, will go to the Philippines before coming home. Stay with us. Vietnam, My Homeland by Vietnamese musician Trung Tan. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's five-nation tour of Asia will include a stop in the Philippines to attend a summit meeting of Pacific Rim leaders in Manila and to meet with Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, who's been overseeing a bloody war on drugs. On Thursday, Duterte gave a defiant speech to promote his drug war ahead of the summit and used obscene language to hit back at critics of his deadly drugs crackdown. Since Duterte was elected in 2016, more than 7,000 people have been extrajudicially killed by police or vigilantes. While human rights groups have condemned Duterte, he's received backing from President Trump, who invited Duterte to the White House. Human Rights Watch slammed the invitation by saying, by effectively endorsing Duterte's murderous war on drugs, Trump has made himself morally complicit in future killings. Well, I recently sat down with Rafi Lerma, an incredibly brave, award-winning photojournalist who's documented Duterte's war on drugs. Rafi Lerma is usually based in the Philippines, but he was in New York to discuss his work. A Huffington Post profile described one of Lerma's nights on the job like this, quote, photographer Rafi Lerma was only a few minutes into the overnight shift for the Philippine Daily Inquirer when he received word that 3 bodies had been found on the streets of Manila. Out he went to capture the image. Then there was a drug bust, and a few hours later, an extrajudicial killing. It was in his first night back on the shift, and he was shocked by the rate the calls were coming in. Well, a warning to our viewers. Many of Rafi Lerma's images show graphic violence. I began by asking him to describe what's happening in the Philippines right now.
It's really overwhelming what's happening in the Philippines right now. There are close to 14,000 people have been killed in this, the name of the drug war, and 4,000 of which have been claimed by police in police operations. They claim that they have killed 4,000 people, and the rest are unexplained killings. Those they say that are deaths under investigation, and some of them are the vigilante killings. And well, yes, so many people have been killed.
One of Rafi Lerma's most famous photographs documents President Duterte's war on drugs, showing a woman, Jenilyn Olaides, grieving as she cradles the lifeless body of her husband, Michael Ciaron. Next to him is a sign left by his killers that reads, "I am a drug pusher, do not copy." Rafi, your photo is known as the Pieta image, because it echoes the Pieta sculpture in the Vatican that shows the Virgin Mary cradling the dead body of Jesus. Talk about the night that you took this photograph.
Well, I could remember still what happened that night. We came from another crime scene. Actually, Michael Ciaron was the third killing that night out of 4. And I could already see that there was a strong picture. It's rarely you see a family member inside the police cordon and beside the victim. And she was holding on to her partner, Michael Ciaron. And when later on, I interviewed Jenilyn Olaides, and she told me she wanted to feel if the body of Michael Ciaron was still hot or warm, if he was still alive. And also I could remember still how she was telling us to stop taking pictures and just to help them.
And how did you feel about that?
To be honest, like a vulture.
You felt like a vulture?
Yes. And we were praying on taking pictures, and we couldn't do anything. And well, I have to do my job, but it was really, you felt you wanted to do something more, but you also have to do your job.
And how does Jenilyn feel now about this picture you took that has become so famous? She has become this image very much showing the pain of what is happening. I mean, you're talking about like more than 10 people killed on average every night. And we're talking about by police, by vigilantes, all coordinated in this war on drugs that is coordinated by the president of your country, the Philippines, Duterte.
Well, it's hard to speak for Jeneline. I'm still in contact with her and their family, but she would rather not remember it and remember what happened, and that she wants to, of course, forget about it and move on. But still, it's hard.
Did she tell you about Michael and who he was?
Of course. And I remember, too, that I think it was 4 days later, I went to the wake of Michael Sharon. And first, the family members were hesitant of letting media to the wake, because first, of course, what happened that night, and kind of they were feasted upon. Everyone taking their pictures and film crews.
It came about because of your photograph, which Duterte specifically addressed.
Yes.
Clearly, you got to him.
Yes.
Because you captured what is happening on his streets with his own so-called law enforcement forces. He called your photograph overly dramatic and criticized it as fake.
Yes, he did mention it in the State of the Nation address. He did mention that. He said it was overly dramatic and you're being portrayed like Mother Mary and Jesus Christ. I really felt sorry for the Jeneline Liars and the family of Michael Sharon, because they're already grieving, and he should have given them that dignity already, for me. But the second part is, I think, I'm not sure, again, with the word, if I was vindicated, that the photo was mentioned during the State of the Nation address, that it reached the person who had to be reached. It was the president. And now people began talking about the drug war and the killings.
President Trump visiting the Philippines. Trump shocked many when he talked about his admiration for Duterte. I want to go to a clip of Philippines President Duterte. In his own words, last September, Duterte likened himself to Hitler.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there's a 3 million drug addicts. There are. I'd be happy to slaughter them. At least, if Germany had Hitler, the Philippines would have. But, you know, my victims, I would like to be all criminals.
Philippines President Duterte, your thoughts on what he said, talking about Hitler and more?
Well, if they're not owning up to these killings, I don't know what. I mean, he's the president, and saying this does not help in solving the killings. He's instigating, he's promoting it.
And then you have our president, the President of the United States, President Trump, who seemed to endorse the so-called war on drugs of Duterte. Duterte, who spoke with Trump by telephone, said Trump was quite sensitive to our worry about drugs. He wishes me well, said Duterte. In my campaign, he said, we're doing it as a sovereign nation the right way. And I want to share with you the words of President Trump. I just wanted to congratulate you because I am hearing the unbelievable job on the drug problem, Trump said in an April 29th phone call, according to a leaked transcript of the conversation with Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte, published by The Intercept and also obtained by The Washington Post and The New York Times. Trump said, many countries have the problem. We have a problem. But what a great job you are doing. And I just wanted to call and tell you that, President Trump said.
Well, sorry to say this, but I hope what's happening in the Philippines does not happen here. if they're solving the drug problem this way and killing people, I hope it does not happen in America.
And what thoughts do you have on President Trump coming to meet the Philippines President Duterte?
Well, I hope that he is more aware of what the human rights situation is happening in the Philippines, and it should be addressed. He's the leader of the free world. He should set an example, and I hope he says something about it now.
Rafi Lerma, award-winning photojournalist based in Manila, Philippines, where he was a staff photographer for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. He's been documenting the government's war on drugs, now a freelance photographer. President Trump is set to meet with Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte this weekend during his five-nation tour of Asia, which includes a stop in the Philippines to attend a summit meeting of Pacific Rim leaders in Manila. Since Duterte has taken office last year, 7,000 people have been killed by police and vigilantes in his so-called war on drugs. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, 350.org founder Bill McKibben, as we head off to Bonn, Germany for the UN Climate Summit. Stay with us.
Tienda bakal papay, ili-ili tulog anay.
Hush, Hush, Baby, Sleep Now, performed by the Filipino musician Lea Salonga. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show by looking at the UN Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany. Democracy Now! Is headed to the summit today. We'll be broadcasting all next week from Bonn. There will be a number of U.S. delegations, despite the fact President Trump says he's willing, that he is pulling the U.S. out of the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Accord. The Trump administration is sending officials to push coal, gas, and nuclear power during a presentation at the summit. The presentation Monday is entitled "The Role of Cleaner and More Efficient Fossil Fuels and Nuclear Power in Climate Mitigation." It'll feature speakers from coal company Peabody Energy, nuclear engineering firm NuScale Power, and a liquefied natural gas exporter. Meanwhile, a coalition of U.S. cities, companies, universities, and faith groups have opened a 2,500-square-meter pavilion outside the UN Climate Summit called We Are Still In, an effort to persuade other countries that wide swaths of the United States are still committed to the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Accord. This comes as Syria's government said Tuesday it'll sign on to the Paris Agreement on climate change. This means that if the U.S. pulls out of the Paris deal, as Trump has vowed, the U.S. will be the only country on Earth that's not a part of the landmark 2015 agreement. For more, we're joined by Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org. In 2014, Bill won the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, for his work in environmental activism, author of a number of books about the climate. But he has a most recent book. Why he's in New York right now. I saw him at Strand Bookstore, the legendary independent bookstore, last night, reading from his book, his first novel, and it's called Radio Free Vermont, A Fable of Resistance. Bill, we're going to get to that. But first, let's talk about these latest developments. Syria followed Nicaragua. Nicaragua had said they weren't going to sign because it wasn't effective enough. But now Syria and Nicaragua joining the Paris Climate Accord leaves the U.S. alone in the world?
Which is, if you think about it, particularly remarkable because what country has poured more carbon into the atmosphere than any other in the long history of burning coal, gas, oil? Our almost unbelievable decision to back away even from this quite modest Paris Accord is probably the most dramatic act of American diplomacy almost ever. I mean, we're literally saying we know more than everybody else in the world about the biggest problem the planet's ever faced.
So talk about what is going to happen at this UN Climate Summit. It is the first one. I mean, last year when we were in Marrakesh, President Trump had just been elected. I mean, the place was just buzzing with the fact that a proud climate denier was now going to be the president of the United States. But now he's pulling the U.S. out. What does it mean? And talk about the different formations that will be there.
So the U.S. is still sending a delegation. We want it both ways. We're having rejected the Paris Accord. We now want to screw up any efforts to keep it going forward by other countries. You know, it's like, I don't know what it's like. It's like breaking off your engagement, but saying, here's what you want the children named, 10 years in the future. So we'll be there officially saying, burn more coal. That's our message that we're sending over a panel of coal executives to say. There's a group of mayors and governors and things who are saying, for our states and cities, we're still in. We're going to try to keep the Paris Accords. And then, probably most importantly, there's the kind of movement-based group, this U.S. People's Delegation that's emerging. Many people that you've had on over the years, Dallas Goldtooth from the Indigenous Environmental Network, Vashini Prakash, others, who are reminding us that even if we had carried out every promise that everybody made in the Paris Climate Accords, the planet would still warm more quickly than we can possibly deal with. They're the ones saying the whole world needs to be moving toward 100% renewable energy quickly, and it needs to be keeping fossil fuel in the ground. So,
and that formation is called?
The People's Delegation. And my guess is they'll have the most in common with people around the world, other delegations trying hard to move this process forward. The way to just imagine official American position is we're not the caboose on the train. We're tossing an anchor off the caboose, trying to bring the whole show to a halt.
So a lot has been made in this first year since Donald Trump was elected, that he has not passed any significant legislation. But doesn't this obscure the fact, especially in the area of the environment, they are moving full speed ahead?
Absolutely. The environment's the place where arguably he's done the most damage. And in a sense, it's not really Trump in this case. This would have happened with almost any Republican because this is the Koch brothers' agenda. This is what they've wanted forever. Scott Pruitt is their man, and they're dismantling. Yeah, they're dismantling 30 years worth of environmental regulation in the course of a few months. It's a slaughter on the environment. And of course, the reason that that's so dangerous is, with climate change in particular, this is the one time-limited problem the world has ever faced. We're not going to have a chance to repair the damage because by the time the Trump administration is over, we're going to be, much further along the process of melting ice caps, acidifying oceans, breeding storms. That's what's happening now. We're losing, above all, time, desperately needed time.
Talk about what happened in India, in New Delhi this week.
New Delhi closed 4,000 schools because the air is so bad. Our machines, our instruments that measure small particulates in the atmosphere go up to 999 parts per million. The machines stopped working a few days ago because the levels were way above that. 999 parts per million is 30 times the safe level. We're someplace, they say that the equivalent of just breathing the air in Delhi at the moment is smoking 50 cigarettes a day. I've been there in the last couple of years, and it wasn't as bad as it is today, but it was so bad that you did not want to be outdoors at all.
And we just reported on Puerto Rico once again. We just came back from Puerto Rico, hit by Hurricane Maria. Now, I mean, I think something in the range of 80-something% of the people do not have electricity. Once again, it's going backwards.
Amy, I wrote the first book on climate change 30 years ago. Back then, it was abstract. We knew what was coming, but we didn't know exactly what it was going to look like. By this point, every single issue of your broadcast is a kind of gazetteer of the destruction wrought by what we've done to the environment.
The fires of Marin, where we were just, I mean, in Napa and Santa Rosa, absolutely horrifying, the devastation we saw there. The flooding of Houston, the heart of the petrochemical industry, and of Florida.
The U.S. covers 2% of the world's surface. So in the last 60 days, on that 2% of the planet, we've seen the largest rainstorm in American history with Hurricane Harvey, the longest extreme windstorm in the planet's history with Hurricane Irma. We saw Puerto Rico knocked back 30 years in its development. And then we saw those fires in Napa and Sonoma. If there's any place on the world that kind of stands for the good life, there you are in beautiful California terrain surrounded by big vats of wine, you know, and yet there were people fleeing for their lives and some people not able to flee fast enough.
Many people died, perished in the fires. We only have a minute and then we're going to do a post-show interview, a web exclusive, but so are you calling for secession for your state?
No, I don't think Vermont's going to secede, but the point of Radio Free Vermont is to kind of try and write a love letter to this resistance. You know, I've spent the last 10 or 15 years trying to play my small part around the environment, and I've loved watching in the last year as this widespread resistance has sprung up to Donald Trump. This book, my first attempt at fiction, is an attempt to be a little humorous and a little loving, because that resistance needs to keep spreading and it needs to be as creative as it possibly could. Bernie Sanders said on the back, he said, we don't need to secede, but Vermont has a long tradition of standing up to power. Boy, we need it now more than ever.
And in just a brief summary, tell us what Radio Free Vermont, a fable of resistance, is about.
Well, it's about a small band of Vermonters led by a septuagenarian radio host who decide that the place that they love, this local, small, strange little state, is just being eroded by the forces of bigness and national consumer culture. And so they begin to take steps in defense of the place they love. They end up nonviolent fugitives from the law, and they have a series of adventures that conclude not only with what may be the only cross-country ski chase scene in American literature, but consuming an inordinate amount of Vermont's great product, the microbrewed beer in which we lead the world in production.
Well, we'll do a web exclusive. You can check it out at democracynow.org about Radio Free Vermont, a fable of resistance. It's the first novel of our guest, the founder of 350.org, Bill McKibben, a proud Vermonter himself. And that does it for our broadcast. We have paid internships. You should check the applications at democracynow.org. Special thanks to Charina Nadura, the Rafi Lerma interview.